This morning, Genesis chapter 38, and if you need a Bible and you forgot yours, you want to follow along, we have ones that we loan out, so keep your hand raised high, and Zeke's going to pass them out. By the way, Zeke, there's another one up in the front row here, one of our loaner Bibles. Anybody else need a Bible? Keep your hand up so Zeke can see you. Genesis chapter 38. And as we've been making our way through Genesis, we've had a couple of odd chapters thrown in the mix here. And when I say odd, I mean like chapter 36, the genealogy of Esau. And that was kind of fun. We all laughed about that. And why is this in the Bible? And we learned some interesting things from it. And then this chapter, some, as they just, if you were reading a book and you're reading, and let's say Genesis is the book you're reading, for fun, you're reading. You're like, well, this seems kind of weird that this is thrown in the middle here. It's almost like a hiccup in the middle of this story as we've left, the story of Jacob, and we've followed then his son Joseph into Egypt as his brothers sold him into slavery to the Midianites, who carried him away to Egypt and then sold him as a slave. And then now we're going to go to one of Joseph's older brothers, Judah, and we're going to just take a look at him. Now, there is a lot of importance, and if you really think about the prophetic picture of all that's going on in Genesis altogether, and especially chapter 38, Judah's an incredibly important figure in the 12 sons of Jacob. And the reason for that is through him would come the messianic line. Jesus is a descendant of Judah. Very interesting. But we're going to see here on Father's Day an example of a not-so-good father. There is one thing in here, by the way, I will point out as we get through the chapter, that as a father he did, that I would really encourage you, if you're a father this morning, that you take to heart and that you apply to your role as a father in the house. But when we get to that, I'll deal with it. In the meantime, just know that most of what Judah does in this chapter is a bad example. Do not do this. It's like, do not do this at home kind of a thing, right? Like you see on Mythbusters. But, we've talked so much about the promised land, Canaan being the promised land, and how much it took for God to get his people into the promised land, getting, sending out to Padan Aram for wives and coming back and dwelling in the promised land. And we have Jacob, and how hard it was to get him to be in the right place, to Hebron when he was supposed to be there. He spent 10 years in a wicked city, and then they ended up killing all the inhabitants of the city because of wickedness that was all really Jacob's fault. And you find this interesting thing that as people, we have our proverbial promised lands, don't we? We have places where God, when we know we are where God wants us to be, and where oh man, I just know this is what I'm supposed to be doing. And I know what it's like to dwell for years in a place that I knew was not my land, and have to wait and wonder where was God gonna plant me. And my wife and I, the Lord used that image for us so powerfully to cause us to not sink roots where we were. And that's really weird too, because the whole thing started on Maui. We're living on Maui of all places, and the Lord keeps telling me this is not your land, and I'm like, but why, Lord? The land is flowing with papaya and mango and waves every day, and it's just not your land. I'm like, okay. But it's interesting, you can actually, and this is Judah's a picture of this, you can dwell in the promised land without having the promised land dwell in you. Did you ever realize that? You can be living right in the midst of the land God has called you to dwell in. And not just the 50 by 100, if you're lucky, maybe 100 by 100, whatever it is you got at home. Not that, not the town, not the job, but, in so many different ways, But you can live in the land and in the place and doing the things that God has called you to do without having the promised land and the meaning and the significance of dwelling in the place where God has you to dwell in you. And I think Judah is a perfect example of that. The children of Israel at this point had been exposed to so much worldliness by, their fathers, specifically by Jacob in Shechem, and even in Padan Aram, that the promise of the land, the promised land, had been diluted in their hearts. The significance of it was not quite as meaningful as it should have been. And yet here we have God forming a nation. And in order for God to form a nation and for the nation to remain separate from the rest of the world, God needed to isolate them, even bring them back out of the promised land again, to isolate in their hearts the difference between the holiness of the promised land, the purpose of the nation that they are, and where they were at as people. And that's so often the way we are as Christians. We could be dwelling right in the promised land, but the Lord needs to rip us out of it for a time to show us the significance and the importance of who we are as people, called out. The church, the word for the church in the Greek New Testament was ekklesia. It meant called out assembly. Called out of what? You're called out of the world to live holy and righteous, not by your own strength, but to take in your mind the significance of who you are as a people. We're a called out assembly. That's important. Sometimes the world needs to pull us away from the land, and then, that's what the Lord did with me. He took me out to Bible college, out to Arizona, to the desert, to here and there and the other place, just to help me define who I was and my significance and my role in the promised land, and then he brought me back there. To take them away from all the other people in Canaan and develop them without the influence of the Canaanites was going to be critical. And that's the whole reason why we left Joseph in Egypt. Jonathan being in Egypt, Jonathan being sold into slavery by his brothers was the reason, was what God was going to use, the method God was going to use to bring the worldliness and the influence of the worldliness out of Israel, the nation. And how he was going to do that is eventually, as we go forward, 39, 40, and so on, the whole nation is going to have to dwell in Egypt for a time and be separate from the Canaanites. Okay. So, Israel is headed for Egypt in slavery. We've alluded to that. And slavery was God's way of taking the descendants of Israel or Jacob and making them separate in the midst of multitude. We talked about that. But now, before we follow Joseph's rise to power, which he will, he will rise. Joseph will rise to the second highest position on earth. He will be the second most powerful man on earth during his day. That is Joseph. Did I say Jonathan again? I'm sorry. Joseph. And that's interesting. Because we start to wonder, who would be the modern equivalent? Joe Biden, maybe? I don't know. Who's the second most powerful? Why are you shaking your head no? But anyway, we're taking this break from Joseph as he's going to be apart, and there's a lot of time that passes in Judah's life, and during this time, Joseph is following that rise to power. And as we'll find out, he's sold into the house of a powerful man amongst Pharaoh's people. And we get here to Genesis chapter 38, and we're going to follow Judah for a little while here and see what happens with him. Terrible story here. It's just awful. But it says in verse 1 that it came to pass at that time, the time which, Judah and his brothers headed back to Hebron from having been out in the plains of Shechem, having sold their brother into slavery, having had to report to their father, this dream coat, this Technicolor dream coat that we talked about, that probably was just a long sleeve, maybe with multicolor coat. But, full of blood, they deceived their father, couldn't even say their own brother's name in front of their father Jacob. And all this heaviness, it says that Judah departed from his brothers and visited a certain Adullamite whose name was Hira. Now, again, I'm placing sort of an inference or a suggestion on why he left. But this is my suggestion. I believe that he was overwhelmed with not being able to live with what he'd done. I think, watching his father grieve, and we learned in a couple last chapter, that his father just grieved for many, many years over his missing son whom he loved, Joseph. He loved more than the other brothers. So, by the way, a bad thing to do, fathers. You don't want to show favoritism in your family. It's not a good thing. But so we have Judah here. I think he's probably motivated by wanting to separate himself from this lie that he's perpetuated, watching his father, having no relationship with his father because his father's taken out of the picture. His father's just grieving and grieving and grieving. And he travels not far. Adullam. Adullam was where he went, and it was a Canaanite city approximately 8 miles to the north and a little to the west from Hebron. And at this point, he goes because he knows a guy there. He's developed a friendship with this guy, Hira, and so he's going to go spend some time away from the family. But at this point, okay, so you're separating yourself from the family, but wait a minute. He not only does that, that's fine, but he actually goes out and he begins to concern himself with his own needs. Big mistake. We're going to see that here, verse 2. Judah saw there a daughter of a certain Canaanite whose name was Shua, that's the father, and he married her and went into her. Now, since all the sons of the daughter of Shua are rejected by God for the messianic lineage because they're Canaanites, right? And here's Jacob going to be a part of the messianic lineage, going to be a part of the inheritance of God. He knew he shouldn't be seeking a wife from among the Canaanites. He knew that. In fact, he should have gone to his father. If it's, look, you want a wife? Go to your father. Maybe that'll help your father get out of his mourning and his funk. But he doesn't do that. He goes and he takes matters into his own hand, and he turns to the daughter of a pagan Canaanite named Shua. She, no doubt, was raised in a pagan household, and she refuses to convert to Judaism. Whether he actually tried or not, we don't know. But he did not choose wisely, and he probably just didn't wait long enough. He figured, I'm getting on with my life. I'm away from my parents. I'm going to take matters in my own hand. And he takes this wife for himself, and she conceived and bore a son, and he called his name Now notice, at this point, Judah chooses the name for the firstborn son here. And the next two sons she will choose the name for. But the first name is which simply meant watcher. Most would agree it meant someone who was very observant. He was a watcher. He was paying close attention to everything that was going on. And so she conceived again, verse 4 says, and bore another son, and his name she called Onan, which meant strength. And she conceived yet again and bore a third son and called his name Shelah. He was at Chezib when she bore him. Then Judah took a wife for his firstborn, and her name was Tamar. But Judah's firstborn, was wicked in the sight of the Lord. And listen, the Lord killed him. I think the King James might say slew him. We don't really know how the Lord killed him. We've seen many instances throughout the Bible, Old and New Testament, how the Lord brought people to the ground and they suffered and died. But this particular individual, probably not a good name that you want to maybe choose for a son or a daughter, I would say, because this guy's wicked in the sight of the Lord, and the Lord just slew him. And we don't know why. We're not told what he did or what it was that he was so wicked, but we can sort of guess that since he's a watcher, he's called the Watcher, that's his name, he was sort of watching and choosing for himself what to believe, and Judah wasn't a real good example of what the descendants of Abraham believed. They were certainly aware of a different way of thinking, a different God that existed amongst them in the descendants of Abraham. And so he was looking at Judah's life and not seeing anything all that appealing, and he probably chose his mom's religion, I would think, a pagan religion. And there was something very, very wicked about him that he had chosen for himself, and God chose just to simply end his life. Now, I think we have to remember there that it's very significant who enters into the lineage of Judah. And so God's not going to allow someone to enter into the lineage of Judah that's going to, down the road in his foreknowledge, destroy the nation of Israel. And he takes this one out. And then it says in verse 8, Judah said to Onan, his second son, go into your brother's wife and marry her and raise up an heir to your brother. This was a principle that was practiced in that day. At the time, we now refer to it as the Levirate marriage. The Levirate marriage. It was the carrying on of your brother's posterity. Later, we refer to it as the kinsman redeemer in the book of Ruth. You might remember it. And this actually becomes law. In fact, 34 of the Levitical laws, or the laws found in Deuteronomy, have their very beginning in the book of Genesis that we see them to be Mosaic law. And so you're like, well, here's the laws that pre-exist, 34 of them that pre-exist the actual writing of the law. So they actually knew. This is proof that they knew what was right and wrong. They knew what God thought was the right thing to do and what God thought was the wrong thing to do before Moses even actually wrote out a lot of the laws. Now, this principle, the Levirate marriage, it comes from the Hebrew word yebum, and I'm sure I'm not pronouncing that correctly, but it was the Latin version of the word that was pronounced Levirate, and it became part of the law in Deuteronomy. You can look it up, chapter 25, verses 9 through 10. Now, the idea behind this law, just culturally speaking, take a look at it for a second. Okay, so, the father has a couple sons. Sons are important in this culture. Here's why. sons would provide for not only their own families, but for their moms and for their parents. And as we see here, examples of many wives, well, these sons were born from this mother, they'll take care of that mom when she gets old. And so, in this situation, however, it's the same mom, but here that Onan, if he does this thing, if he fulfills this law, that whatever children he bears through her would not be his. Would not be his. They would belong to his dead brother, In fact, they would provide for their mother, and they would be separate. He would be responsible for raising them, providing for them, caring for them, but really receive nothing from them. And so he has no interest in really fulfilling this Levirate law. But in verse 9 it says this, knowing all this, it says, Onan knew that the heir would not be his, and it came to pass when he went into his brother's wife that he emitted on the ground, lest he should give an heir to his brother. Now, if you were to study this in the original language, and some of us often do that, I try not to do that because I end up falling asleep while I'm doing it, but it's very, it is profitable when I do spend the time and do that. What you will find is that the indication here is not that this is a one-time thing. The indication is that there's plurality in this verse. In other words, that Onan didn't only do this once, that he made a practice of going in to his brother's wife, having sexual relations with her, and emitting on the ground. That is not fulfilling his responsibility. And it says in verse 10, look what happened as a result of this. This thing which he did displeased the Lord. Therefore, he, capital H, the Lord, killed him also. Killed him also. And you're like, wow, man, the Lord's pretty serious about this. Well, it's the Messianic line. It's an important thing. Now, a lot of different teachings have come out of these couple of verses here, and let me just clear up a couple things. What Onan is guilty of is selfishness and disobedience. Okay? That's what he's being punished by God for. Some have actually used this verse to talk about masturbation and say that, this is a proof text to say that it's got to be sin. It's got nothing to do with that. It doesn't. So you can't use this verse in order to teach that principle. Now, there's another principle that people teach here that they try to say that birth control is unbiblical because of this. Because in a sense, you're trying to control whether the woman has a child or not by not, giving your seed to her. Well, that is also not the context for this verse. It's not what God's trying to say to us here. There was a law in place that he was supposed to fulfill, and God takes this very seriously because it's the progeneration of people, and this is the Messianic line. This is serious stuff we're talking about here. So this is not a proof case for either of those two topics, and you might want to take note of that. There's other verses you can use to try to build your theology on those subjects. Anyway, verse 11, Judah said to Tamar, his daughter-in-law, "You killed two of my sons. Now get out of here." No, what he says, "Remain a widow in your father's house till my son Shelah is grown." For he said, lest he also die as his brothers did. And Tamar went and dwelt in her father's house. So go back home and wait. Now this is not a righteous thing to do. Not at all for Judah. In fact, Judah should have taken Tamar into his own house and cared for her and provided for her. His two sons, one of them evil and wicked, and the other one just disobedient, refusing to fulfill the law, both of them failed. It wasn't Tamar's fault. Now, wait till you see what happens in this story, because it's incredibly fascinating from God's perspective. But notice Tamar, she's obedient and does what he says. She goes, okay. She goes back to her father's house. She dwells with him. And this was, by the way, this was one of the reasons why what was required in order to marry was a dowry, and the prospective son-in-law would bring a sum of money or a sum of wealth to the fathers of the daughter's house, and should something happen to the son and the father have to take care of the daughter for the rest of her life, he would have the wherewithal or the money or the provision in which to do that. So she goes back to her father, and it says in the process of time, verse 12. So obviously, at this point in the process of time means that some time has passed now. The daughter of Shua, Judah's wife, died. In the process of time, the daughter of Shua, And then it says, Judah's wife died, and Judah was comforted and went up to his sheep shearers at Timnah, and his friend Hira, the Adullamite, apparently went with him. So time has passed. Tamar's with her father Shua. Judah's wife dies. We never knew her name, the daughter of Shua. We never knew her name. She dies. Now he's grieving, and in order probably to comfort himself, it's time to take the sheep up to Timnah, and Hira and he go up, and they go to do this thing. And verse 13, you'll see, we now go back to Tamar. It says, it was told Tamar, saying, look, your father-in-law is going up to Timnah to shear his sheep. She's been just hanging out, waiting for Judah to do something. He promised me that when his youngest son, was old enough, that he would come and he'd fulfill the law, and I would then have some posterity. I would have a son, hopefully, or a daughter, or something from him. And so she finds out what happened to Judah's wife. We're never told her name, just that she is Shua's daughter. And she passes away, and he goes up in grief to Timnah to shear his sheep. And so this is what she does. She took off her widow's garments. The whole time she has kept herself wearing widow's garments, being very obedient. And now she covers herself with a veil and wrapped herself and sat in an open place which was on the way to Timnah. For she saw that Shelah was grown, and she was not given to him as a wife. Absolute manipulation. Absolute manipulation. But as we're going to see, she's far more righteous than Judah in what she's doing. But we'll get to that in a minute. But she dresses, she wears the clothes, and it's interesting too because she wore a veil, which to me is, she's doing a sinful thing. She's playing the role of a harlot or a hooker, and she's covering her face, and we see that it's symbolic of the shame and wanting to cover and hide the shame. At least I do anyway. But she intentionally deceives Judah, and she's just taking a shot. She's out there alongside the road, hoping that in his grief he might seek to please himself or to comfort himself by taking for himself, a woman, of the evening. Now, the Canaanites, by the way, had a custom that you should be aware of that's pertinent to this particular section, that around the time of the shearing of the sheep, there was a ritual of intercourse with usually temple prostitutes. And they thought that in doing this, it was like worshiping the god of fertility, and in the years to come, the production of their sheep and their offspring would be multiplied. So there'd be additional wool because of it, and there'd be additional sheep because of this. And so they thought that sex was an act, prostitutional sex was an act of a worship to the god of having more goats and sheep or whatever. So, that. Now, why I say that? Well, Judah is clearly placed himself square in the influence of the Canaanites, and that's the picture that's the thing we gotta watch. I mean, we live in a worldly place. Every one of us. I know this country, was founded on Christian principles. I know most of our laws came from the Bible. I know all that. But you know what, guys? That ship has kind of sailed, hasn't it? I mean, it was in the media just recently that our own president said that we're no longer, I don't know whether he said we're no longer or we're just not a Judeo-Christian country. And someone else commented how, if that's the case, and somebody was just telling me about this, I don't know whether it was Chris Tochi or somebody, if this is the case, when did that stop? When is it that if we were once a Judeo-Christian country, when did that stop and what are we now? Those are good questions, and they're good things for us to consider. And we really have to be careful that the influences of the Canaanites or the Americans or those of this country who care nothing for the things of God, that we're not taking on their influence, that we're not taking on their practices. And it requires a good amount of concentration that we consider and we think about the things that we do. How do we know if we're doing the things that they do that we're not supposed to be? How do we know? The only way is if we know God's will versus their will. And how we find that out is by spending time in the Word, in fellowship with our brothers and sisters, in prayer, seeking the Lord. Seek to please God. Seek to please God first, and all other things will fall in place. Judah's being exposed to cultural compromise. We are being exposed every day to cultural compromise. There's all kinds of pressures on us to compromise our convictions. And, Judah's certainly being exposed to those things. And now, in a moment of weakness, his wife passes away, and he gives in to cultural compromise. So, verse 16, he comes across Tamar. He turned to her by the way, and he said, "Please let me come in to you," for he did not know that she was his daughter-in-law, Tamar. So she said, "What will you give me that you may come in to me?" This is the negotiation part. And, what strikes me as odd is, the negotiation here is, could you imagine this, somewhere in Manhattan, somewhere around 42nd Street, this conversation going on, "Hey, how about a goat? How will that do for you?" Obviously, a goat has additional significance in this time, and we don't really appreciate the financial security of a goat and what that means to you, being able to provide milk and so on and so forth. But nonetheless, it really doesn't matter to Tamar at this point what the deal is for, does it? She doesn't care. So she obviously is going to say yes, but she's very wise, and he said, verse 17, "I'll send you a young goat from the flock." So she said, "Will you give me a pledge till you send it?" Wise girl, very smart. What are you going to give me? Because I'm just going to hey, listen, all right, I'll give you my services, and then, trust that someday you're going to send this young goat along, And so she says, what pledge shall I, will you give me a pledge? He says, verse 18, "What pledge shall I give you?" And she answered and said, "I want your signet, your cord, and your staff that's in your hand." So what are these things, and what significance are they? Well, the signet later went on to be a ring. It might even be a ring in this place. In this moment in time, we don't know whether it was a ring or not. But what it was something that had an embossed figure on it, that if you were to stamp it in wax, you were to stamp it in something, it was your family insignia. And it was basically your guarantee. So, anything that your stamp was on, your signet was on, basically meant that you guaranteed it. And then somebody would recognize it and say, "Well, I know who this belongs to. This is this family. This is Judah's family, the descendants of Abraham. And so they're responsible for whatever this thing is." And so she says, very wisely, "I'll take your signet and your cord." Now, we don't necessarily know what the cord was. It could have been something that the signet hung on around his neck. And your staff, which basically, he's on his way to have his sheep sheared. He needed his staff. He was a shepherd. So the insurance of payment that was the family seal and all the items that were identity related to Judah. If you saw these 3 items laying on the side of the road and they were lost, you would pick them up and be able to figure out very easily who they belong to. It's like, "Let me have your wallet, because I know your driver's license and your credit cards." It's the same thing. Leave me your wallet with all that information in there, and then when you bring me back the young goat, I'll give you back your wallet. So, okay, fine, deal. So we gave him to her, second part of verse 18, "and went in to her, and listen, she conceived by him. So she arose and went her way, and laid aside her veil, and put on the garments of her widowhood." She went back to the place where she should have been all along, standing in her righteousness, acting as though she were a widow. And then verse 20, Judo. Guy was a martial arts expert. By the way, it is the East. He's a martial arts expert. Now, Judah sent the young goat by the hand of his friend the Adullamite. So here it goes out. And by the way, it's interesting, isn't it, how he sends out his friend the Adullamite instead of going himself, right? He doesn't even send his own son. He's trying to conceal his own identity from his own sin, I think, anyway. So he sends out Hira to go out, and you see here, it continues to say, to receive back his pledge from the woman's hand. But Hira could not find her. Then he asked the men of that place, saying, "Where is the harlot who was openly by the roadside?" And they said, "There was no harlot in this place." And he returned to Judah and said, "I cannot find her." Also, the men of the place said that there was no harlot in this place. Then Judah said, "Let her take them for herself, lest we be shamed. For I sent this young goat and you, and have not found her." So the inhabitants of that area, the roadside along the way to Timnah, have never heard of there ever being a harlot there. So this was some, what was it? Was it a UFO, Judah? What's happened there? And it's gone, and now all your things are gone. And he just simply says, you know what? Keep the stuff. Let her keep the stuff rather than me be found out and the sin. So he's experiencing the sin, the shame of sin. He knows what he did was wrong, and he's trying to hide it. And, he says, well, just keep going on without that stuff. But here's my question, and this is for all of us. Does God let believers get away with hiding their sin? He might let you go on for a while without it, right? We might go through life and be able to hide our sin, and we might even change churches. We might do all kinds of things, to hide our sin. But eventually, you're found out. Eventually, God's going to bring it to the surface. Why? Well, because not so he can embarrass you. He wants better for you. He wants to give you righteousness. He wants to make you more like Jesus. And he can't do that if you don't allow your sin, you don't allow that transparency to come to the surface. I'm not saying, you know what, it's Sunday, you guys, form a line up here, and I'm going to provide a microphone. I want you all to confess your sin. Let's not do that. First of all, we would need the building for a lot longer. But secondly, that's not what the Bible says, right? Now, there is, in the Bible, we do find a principle where, we do confess some things one to another, but not just arbitrarily to anyone. It's not a thing where, men go to women and confess their sin. It's, usually you go to an elder in the church or a pastor and you sit down and have a private consultation and say, I'm really struggling. I need help. I'm in bondage to something. I need this bondage to be broken. I need help. I need to change, And so, I'll warn you about that. But Judah certainly is trying to conceal his sin. God eventually will find your sin out. And so here, we're going to see how God does that. Verse 24 says, and it came to pass about 3 months after that Judah was told, saying, Tamar, your daughter-in-law, has played the harlot. Furthermore, she is with child by harlotry. So Judah said, bring her out and let her be burned. Oh my goodness, Judah, you're a man of the law. What a righteous man. What a great idea. The law says burn her, we ought to burn her. You're right, Judah. Wow. Man, someone once said, it's better to keep your mouth closed and let everyone think you're a fool than open it and remove all doubt. And clearly here we're going to see Judah is found out. This is absolute hypocrisy, by the way, because he should have all along been taken care of, fulfilling his obligation to give his third son to her. How easy it is to cover my sin of failing to fulfill, he's thinking this. I'm trying to cover my sin of failing instead of fulfilling her rights. I'll just get rid of her. He's going to come to that place. Here's the thing, guys, and here's where we get to the example that he does set for us, which is good. He's faced with his own sin, as we'll see in a moment, and he does the right thing. But by the way, this example of what Judah just did here is why we don't judge others, is why the Bible tells us we ought not to judge. Because, we get to a place where we don't even see our own sin. Every one of us commits sin. We do. Even the ones who have been walking with the Lord the longest, who God has blessed with more holiness, righteousness, and humility, we're still sinners. We still commit sin in the flesh. Sin dwells in our flesh. But we don't judge others unto condemnation. That is, this is a condemning pronouncement. Burn her. That's unto death. And that's not our job. Do we look after each other, care for one another, and judge between ourselves as to what is sin and what is not? Well, yes, but there's very careful instruction on that. This is not a message on the kind of judgment in the church that's good. But there is a sense in which we are to judge ourselves and each other, and there's a lot of instruction on that. But unto condemnation is not our place. Judah has taken that place. Now look what happens. Verse 25. Tamar, when she was brought out, she sent to her father-in-law, saying, by the man whom these belong, I am with child. And she said, please determine whose these are, the signet and the cord and the staff. Very important, the truth, the evidence is sent out by Tamar ahead of her. Isn't that interesting? The truth goes out in her own defense. And you know what, you guys? If you're on the right side of the law, you should have the very same evidentiary practice. The truth should go first. Okay, you want to judge me? Well, examine the truth. Let's bring all the truth. Here it is. You examine the truth, and then you tell me if I'm guilty or not. Right? This is a great principle. There's no need to defend yourself. The truth should be your defense. God will defend you. You know, I've met so many Christians who go around and, you know, they always seem like they're constantly making a defense for themselves. And there's no need to do that. If your walk with the Lord is right, there's no need to defend yourself. And it's always kind of a little telltale. If someone's always making a defense for their actions, it's like usually meaning there's something else going on, you know, that they're not saying. And so the evidence goes out before Tamar, and in verse 26, Judah acknowledged them and said, she, and now listen, fathers, this is a great example, and this is excellent counsel. She has been more righteous than I, because I did not give her to Shula, my son, and he never knew her again. Judah acknowledges that the items that she sent out, because he's busted, right? I mean, here's his wallet with his driver's license and credit cards. He's busted. There's no getting away from this. And he's painted into a corner, but at least he does the right thing. He says, you know what? She's more righteous than I, because she made me fulfill my obligation to God. She forced me to do it. And she's right. Now, he never knew her again, but what I find interesting to think about is, would Tamar have been God's choice had Judah waited? I think so. She ends up in the Messianic line. These two children we're about to meet, and she's about to have these two kids. One of them is Jesus is a descendant, or I should say the Messianic line comes through him. He's not a descendant of his seed, but the Messianic line, he has to obtain through the law the right to the Messianic kingdom, through the line of Judah. And here clearly he does. You'll see this. God's grace working through even the worst of sins is a perfect picture of this entire chapter. He speaks the truth to his own shame and does what is right. We can assume that there would have been a good amount of people around and aware of these circumstances. Could you imagine? You know, Judas sent out word that there's going to be a burning. Everybody shows up, right? Then as everybody shows up to see what happens, here comes his signet ring and his staff and his cord. Oh, well. So he's pretty embarrassed now in front of a lot of people. And again, it would seem that God has chosen Tamar as the one who would bring forth the Messianic lineage. She was more righteous because she was on the right side of the law, while Judah was only seeking to satisfy his own lust. And you know what? If you want to worry about, without having to study the Bible, you know, intensely and learn all the law, you want to try to get a quick read on whether or not a choice that you're going to make is of God or not, figure out what your motivation is. Is it to satisfy myself or my own lusts? You know, not just sexual lusts. I'm talking about lusts for anything. And you can divide pretty easily that way. If my desire for this thing is only to satisfy myself, then it's probably not from God. God has a principle of delayed gratification. You could see this throughout the Scriptures. He promises something, and then it seems like a long time goes by, and eventually he gives it. Delayed gratification. Judah wasn't willing to wait. Now it came to pass, verse 27 says, at the time for giving birth, that behold, twins were in her womb, and so it was. And by the way, you might remember, twins run in the family. Yep. And by the way, something else runs in the family. That is the desire to be first. You're going to see that here too. And so it was when she was giving birth that one of them put out his hand, and the midwife took a scarlet thread and bound it. Now, if you're delivering a baby, this is a very odd thing, is to see a hand come out and then go back in. But according to the law back then, that's the firstborn. The first one to breach the womb is the firstborn. Therefore, all kinds of legal rights is given to that one. So quickly, she grabs the thread and ties it around, knowing that there was the possibility that the hand could disappear again, and it does. So she does this and says, this one came out first. Then it happened, as he drew it back, his brother came out unexpectedly. And she said, how did you break through? This breach be upon you. Therefore, his name was called Perez. Perez is the one whom Jesus would come through. Luke chapter 3, verse 33. Matthew chapter 1. You can read about Perez. You can read about Tamar in the family tree of Jesus. There's an interesting article that Chuck Missler wrote, by the way, on the subject of this particular chapter, chapter 38 of Genesis. And you can go and search this stuff out for yourself. I found it on his website. I'm going to tell you about it. I'm not going to explain it to you because, quite frankly, Chuck Missler's a whole lot smarter than me. So some of you are smarter than me also. You can explain it to me. Go read this article. The article on his website is called Treasures in the Family Tree, and it's a study through the book of Genesis chapter 38. This is what he says here. I'm going to quote him. It is interesting that hidden within the text of Genesis chapter 38 at 49 letter intervals are the names of Boaz, Ruth, Obed, Jesse, and David in chronological order. It's like a numerological study of the Bible, and he's very gifted in these things. And like I said, you can go and look at that. I know some of you will. Please explain it to me later. That's great. But I did look at it in the original Hebrew, and he isolated where the different letters were and how they spelled the different names and how there were 49 letters between them. And I was like, wow, man, this guy's had a lot of free time on his hands. He must not have a daughter named Zoe, I'll tell you that. But listen, you know what? It's just amazing that hidden in the Bible are these things that God did. That's not an accident. Did Moses do that on purpose? Absolutely not. God did it on purpose, though. And so you have these important names, and they're important people in Jesus' history, and they're listed here in Genesis chapter 38, somewhat cryptically. Anyway, verse 30 says, afterward his brother came out, who had the scarlet thread on his hand. His name was called Zerah. Now, Zerah, I'm trying to remember his name, from Zerah eventually would come Achan. Anybody remember Achan? Raise your hand if you remember who Achan is. Anybody? Not a lot. But later on, we're going to find that Israel, in its conquest of the Promised Land, once they come out of Egypt and they're going about the Promised Land and they're destroying the inhabitants of the land as God commands them to do, that Achan takes, and he's a descendant of Zerah, takes some of the idols and the wealth of one of the cities, one of the peoples that they destroy, and he hides it under his tent. And because of this sin, it brings great destruction and great despair to Israel. So, interesting people that we meet here. A lot of practical lessons for us, again, as fathers. And the lesson that Judah gives us, fathers, humility, transparency. The best thing I can do as a father is, sit down at the table with my wife and my daughter and say, you know what, you guys? I need to apologize to you. I was wrong. This thing that I did, whatever it is, I should never have done it. I exposed you guys to my sin. I'm sorry. This is what I'm doing as a consequence of it. What better example can we set as fathers than that, right? Have our kids see us as men, showing them practically what it means to be a Christian, living a life in transparency and humility. We see, by the way, also in this chapter, an overwhelming contrast between the way Judah handles temptation and the way in which Joseph, by the way, we'll see later on, handles temptation. Completely different. And then, lastly, we see an example of legalism that we want to avoid in our own lives. That is, forcing others to live by the law when we're not, in fact, ourselves living by the law. What a horrible example as Christians that would make us. And so let's all stand as the worship team makes their way forward. Let's all stand.